Welcome to the Strategy and Leadership Podcast, folks. My name is Anthony Taylor. I'm joined by Maggie Olson. I was telling Maggie that the first time I encountered a chief of staff was when I was working with an organization called Slingshot Aerospace. I met this guy. He was such a phenomenal person, so organized, so skilled. And I got connected with Maggie, who was the former chief of staff at T-Mobile. And now she runs this incredible organization. Maggie Olson, I'm so excited to chat with you. How's it going today?
Thank you. What a great intro. I love it. It's going great. I mean, besides this being, freezing here in Lincoln, Nebraska, I'm good.
Well, yes, we'll try to warm you up, warm our listeners up with today's podcast, but I'm
Yes.
so excited to chat. For our listeners that don't know what a chief of staff is, what a chief of staff does, can you give them a glimpse first into your past career and now into what you're doing with Nova?
Sure. I've always been kind of that driven achiever type, raising my hand for all the opportunities, pulling a chair up to the table, wanting to be a leader in whatever environment I was in. And I think that is those are common characteristics for chiefs of staff. I eventually found myself in the chief of staff role after completing my MBA, after being a buyer for about 5 years, after moving into an executive development program with T-Mobile that was pretty competitive. And I'd met with half the executive team in order to be placed into this program. And I found myself in a chief of staff role. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to describe it, but I heard things like executive team alignment and organizing the chaos and creating systems and processes and leading business planning, rhythm of business. Again, I didn't know what those things were, but I had an idea. I'm like, okay, I think this sounds like me. Turns out it was absolutely such a good fit. It was a combination of all the things that I've loved about my past roles, all, into one. And I really had the privilege during my time as the chief of staff to the B2B president at T-Mobile, who led a $14 billion business and about 5,000 employees. I had the privilege of building a whole team of people on my chief of staff team, 7 or 8 roles, developed each system, process, position, template, and all of it. And I'd had the entrepreneurial bug. I wanted to go do chief of staff consulting, which I do. And I was having a conversation with my mom about how crazy it is that there's thousands of project management certifications out there and nothing for chiefs of staff. And she said, well, why don't you go build it? So that's where we are today with really a first of its kind chief of staff certification course. It's an online format. We also teach in person. And chiefs of staff, I guess to your final question here, chiefs of staff really are intended to allow the leader, the business leader of, maybe it's a CEO or a VP or, whatever it might be, to focus on what's most important as that leader, to keep their head up, eyes up, focused on the future, thinking about vision, strategy, growth, and leadership, rather than being heads down executing their most important initiatives. So a chief of staff is a high-level strategic partner that leads a lot of business initiatives for the leader. They exist for the leader, which is different than like for the company, which a COO, I would argue, exists for. They drive alignment across leadership teams. They often act as proxy or advisor to the business leader. We'll stop there for now.
That's awesome. Well, what I find fascinating is, I've been facilitating strategy sessions for, 14 years now, inside organizations, big and small. You see a lot of like HR that gets kind of some of those tasks. And then there's like the culture HR and the disciplinary HR. There's the COO that has like the operational tasks, but like it's kind of like a hybrid role-ish. And again, I'm interested on your thoughts on that, of somebody that can really support the CEO, the president, somebody executing, but has to have that, the soft skills, the hard skills, and the ability to manage all of that in one. And I'm also finding it interesting to see the growth of it as an interest, because organizations in these fast moving, people focused environments, extremely competitive, seeing this as an option to kind of really bridge that gap and add that to their strategy team. So I guess my question to you is, what is the trend that you're seeing? How are people discovering that a chief of staff is the right solution for them, whether it's hiring a new one or upskilling them internally?
Yeah, what's interesting is leaders have long known that they need administrative support. They've long known that they shouldn't be the ones scheduling their own emails, scheduling their own meetings, sending all of the same, their own emails, focusing on expenses, logistics, travel, right? They've known this. What is happening is that the chief of staff role is growing because leaders are also figuring out that they need that dedicated human support that's much higher level and strategic, in addition to the administrative support. So, when you think about what a chief of staff does, and you're right, it is a role that is very, very broad. There's a huge breadth of what the chief of staff role can do and does. I talk about the chief of staff role in a sense that the core purpose of the role is the same everywhere, which is what I described earlier, giving that leader exponentially more time to focus on what's most important. But the day-to-day of how that's achieved is completely different depending on so many factors. Chiefs of staff exist across every industry, across every size of business, across every maturity level of business, across every, leadership team makeup, right? So a chief of staff is absolutely going to lean in and cover an operational project. They're going to fill a gap. They might present board material. They might act as proxy for the leader. They may lead events and communications. The goal is that they are giving the leader back time, and they're giving them back time exponentially by taking on kind of their most important initiatives that have nowhere else to land. So, if a leader's like, okay, I have this project, it's obviously a marketing project. My CMO is obviously going to take that. Great. Goes to the CMO. I have an operations project. It's obviously going to my COO. But what about those special projects? The leaders, like most of the leaders we know, and you know this from going into companies for the decade and a half, they are idea generators. There's a million of ideas all the time, and their teams are getting like idea whiplash. What do I follow? Where do I go? There's so many ideas. Here's the thing. We want leaders to stay in that space. We want those visionary leaders. But without a chief of staff or a way to like project manage all of these wild and fun, crazy like initiatives, they get lost. And then it's too hard for the leader to stay in that space. And it's really, really draining on the teams. So a chief of staff organizes, manages, prioritizes, often leads those leaders' most important initiatives that have nowhere else to land, and really like follows up and works through like execution and ensuring the leader's prepared and the team alignment for, everything else.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think it's important that, for a CEO, like the CEO has a role. And of course, it's not only the CEO that has a chief of staff, but if you're a kind of small to medium sized business,
Mm-hmm.
that's likely where the highest opportunity is going to
Mm-hmm.
be. Your job is long-term strategic. You need somebody to kind of be able to bridge the gap. Now, it's not an absolution of responsibility, but it does allow you capacity to focus on what's most important. Where do you see a chief of staff, I'm going to call it going wrong, as in the CEO in this case can't just delegate everything off the plate? Where have you seen chiefs of staff not being the right fit, not the correct solution, not the best step in an organization's growth and maturity?
I think it depends on a few things. One thing that comes up for me is for people who think they want a chief of staff, but really they want like a chief operating officer, for example, or they have other priorities in the company that are less human centric, like less leader support focused. A place that chiefs of staff get it wrong often is by solving company problems before getting their leaders like back office in line. So it's really important for a new chief of staff to come in and like lead and build and make sure it's running really, really well in terms of the rhythm of business. When's the leadership team meeting about current business or past business? When are we looking forward? Strategic planning, 5-year planning. Like, what are all those sessions and how are they happening? How are they happening efficiently and effectively? And who is like doing the doing? Who's doing the follow-ups and all the execution there? The chief of staff often isn't the doer, but they are the person involved in everything, ensuring that the doer is prepared and onboarded and the program or the project is like operational. I think another place that a CEO would get it wrong is if they don't feel like they have the time to commit to giving the chief of staff access to them. If they're like, yeah, I want a chief of staff, but like, I'm so busy, like they're just gonna have to figure it out. And like, they can do it without me. And I'm a busy person. I'm not going to give them my time, nope, it's not going to work. The chief of staff needs really, really strong access to the leader, and you as a leader have to be able to give it. And I think that there's a time and a place when you kind of know, right? Where you're like, this is not the time to bring on a chief of staff. Like I need to get through this next project. And then I'm going to have dedicated, mornings or like a session a couple times a week where I can spend time with my chief of staff. So those are a couple things to think about, but there isn't like necessarily a big category or a certain industry or a certain size of business where it's wrong. It just depends on the leader. And I tell leaders that if they feel like they are spending their time heads down, chasing executional items, um, executing their like initiatives, they have nowhere else to land, and they're just like deep in all that, and they don't have that high level strategic support that's focused on them, their most important initiatives, that's when they need a chief of staff.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think the biggest use case where we've seen, let's call it strategy execution go poorly, is when the CEO cannot do the thing and says they are too busy. If it goes well, they have somebody backfill that, whether it be,
Mhm.
CMO, COO, CFO, or HR, or a chief of staff who is then the bridge between the CEO and the rest of the executive team. Sometimes it's challenging when they're so busy, they're nowhere to be found, but a chief of staff is a nice, complement to that.
Mhm.
So let's look for other folks that are interested in pursuing this as a career. There are lots of very lucrative jobs. I see the job postings that you have. There's
Mm.
great, there's a lot of money behind it. What should people start thinking about if they want to move into a chief of staff role? Maybe it's upgrading from a current leadership role more tailored to being a chief of staff support at that level.
Yeah, well, it's an extremely high trust role. So it's not the kind of role that you generally are going to just interview cold for and get. Of course it happens, but it's much better to spend time networking and to spend time building relationships. It's always going to be easier in your current company. So it's a little bit like, oh, uh-oh, if you don't want to stay in your current company, like go, you're gonna have to work a lot harder. If you're in your current company, if you're happy in your current company, build relationships with senior leaders. Also, start to look out for the chief of staff role, even under different titles. So, chief of staff work's happening everywhere under different titles than chief of staff. Things like business operations manager, business planning, strategic transformation, program management. It honestly is work that's happening all over the place, not under the chief of staff role. And the best way to identify this would be like going to your all hands meeting. Let's say that you're like you're in a sales role and you go to your product meeting, and let's say you're at Salesforce or something and you go to your VP's product meeting, and there's somebody in the back that's like clearly put the slides together because you remember they asked you for something. They're clicking through the slides. The leader's asking them for a few things. They're not an EA, an executive assistant. They're in a little bit of a higher level role, but you just have no idea what their role is. That's a chief of staff. And usually their title is like program management or business operations or business planning or whatever it might be. So identify those roles that look like chief of staff roles, that high level support to a business leader that's not the EA. That person is doing chief of staff work. That's also really helpful. And then consider taking on some special projects. I mean, I am not an advocate for doing two roles at once or like hoping you're going to get recognition that might not get because people are busy and it just can't be guaranteed. We don't want you to burn out, but what could you do to help give yourself some insight over, around if you're going to like the job? And then in the future, if you do, maybe you can, leverage that a little bit in terms of some visibility or speaking on your resume or to some wins in ways that you can say, I've done this work before. That's what we want to be able to say, the confidence to be able to say, I've done this work before. And honestly, that's why I built Nova's course. I want students to be able to say, through the hands-on practice of the course, I've built briefs, I've, put tons of strategic recommendations together, I've thrown complex offsites, I've, approached my work with a project management approach in so many different ways for executive support. Like that's really the goal here.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think it's also an opportunity for our leaders to think, hey, do I have somebody on my team that's doing this? Am I using them to their fullest capability? Maybe I need to not like change their role, but sharpen their list of tasks to be able to get the most out of them if I have them as a glorified EA or a special projects manager, maybe moving into the chief of staff, giving them some support, some framework, some structure to really, build the most value out of the organization. Awesome. I love it. Okay,
Yeah.
last question before I kind of let you kind of share whatever you want to say. How would you say that your career in hospitality trained you to be a successful chief of staff?
Oh, I love that question. Yeah, I started out in hospitality and retail. I was on the food and beverage floors of resorts. Well, it gave me early leadership experience, which if you are listening and you can figure out a way to get early leadership experience, do it. Leadership's the hardest part of every job. It's the thing that keeps people up at night, even leaders who've been leaders for decades. Build that muscle for sure. I think the other component is the customer experience component. My career's in 2 decades of customer experience. That's really foundationally how we built Nova as well, like very focused on customer experience. And every time in food and beverage, like walking up to a table at like a 4-star restaurant, this is the one place they're going for their anniversary, right? Or their birthday once a year. And they are there to have a wonderful experience, and you are there to create that experience. And it's a lot of pressure, and it's a lot of power, and it's a gift. And so I think I learned a lot about creating experiences and dealing with people, staying cool when things are crazy, like, oh, there could be a fire in the kitchen. Nobody knows. So lots and lots of lessons from food and beverage, and a lot of lessons from sports too, which maybe that's for another conversation.
Interesting. I love that. Well, it made me think of like if anybody has seen the show The Bear, which was very popular.
Yeah.
It's like, it is really a gift. As somebody who also spent a very long time in hospitality, you talk to so many people. Like
Yeah.
if you were a barista at Starbucks, that you
Yes.
literally speak to hundreds, if not thousands of people a day, and you're having microtransactions. But a
Yeah.
chief of staff is fundamentally doing the same thing. You have a lot of stakeholders to do. You have so many hats to wear. Everything has to be under pressure. So if you're hiring for these roles, whether formally or informally, I can't highly enough state the like cross training, skill building from folks that have been in
Oh my gosh.
hospitality. It's
Yeah.
you can't buy it.
No.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
you said that so well. I completely agree.
So, what is the last word from you? What do you want people to do as they move forward their organizations? If you want to plug Nova, please feel free. What do you want people to know about being able to access a chief of staff successfully? And then we'll say goodbye.
Yeah, if you're a leader listening, I would just consider how you're feeling about your time, what you're spending your time on. If you feel like you need high level strategic support, that's when you need a chief of staff. And in terms of Nova, we can help you find a chief of staff. We definitely do recruiting and coaching. Our course, we run businesses and teams through our course. We come on person, on site, do in-person trainings, all that. But yeah, I mean, honestly, like I love talking about the chief of staff role. So if you have any questions, just reach out. hello@novachiefofstaff.com.
Awesome. I love that. And also say, Maggie didn't ask me to plug this, but follow them on LinkedIn because,
Oh,
the
yeah.
reason why we do this podcast is to help you as leaders build your organization successfully. And if not now, in the future, but building those capacities, becoming successful to execute, it is a process that takes time. So I'm really grateful, Maggie, for you to come on the show and share all of this with us because I think it's something that people don't know about, but they desperately need. And it's not until you hear the word that you're like, oh, yeah, that's exactly what
Yeah.
I want. So,
Yeah.
Maggie, thanks so much for being here today. It was a blast and wishing you guys nothing but the best.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for having me, Anthony.
That's my pleasure. Folks, my guest today, Maggie Olson, the founder of Nova Chief of Staff. As you look at expanding your organization, driving forward your strategy, making sure you have the right people in the right seats, and a chief of staff might be a place to start looking. If you are looking for doing a strategy offsite in 2025, be sure to reach out to SME Strategy. We'd love to facilitate and work with your chief of staff in making sure the strategy moves forward. So once again, Anthony Taylor, this has been the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. I appreciate you being here. And I'll see you next time. Bye for now.